The air in Oakwood Preserve lay heavy and still, a damp shroud woven by the late May humidity. It pressed down with an almost physical weight, silencing the usual chatter of robins and cardinals, leaving only the drone of distant lawnmowers and the occasional sigh of wilting petunias that lined the immaculate walkways like weary soldiers. Heat radiated from the asphalt, shimmering in the distance, distorting the familiar shapes of manicured lawns and precisely angled mailboxes. On the shaded refuge of his porch, Sergeant Major Elijah Reed, retired, breathed in the thick air, finding small comfort in the faint, intermittent breeze that rustled the leaves of the colossal oak tree standing sentinel on his front lawn. The tree was ancient, its gnarled branches reaching like arthritic fingers towards the oppressive sky, a silent witness to decades of change in the neighborhood. 92 years had etched themselves onto Elijah's frame, leaving him physically frail, reliant on the wheelchair that had become his main mode of transport. Yet, his eyes, dark and deep-set beneath bushy white eyebrows, remained undimmed. They held the sharpness of a lifetime spent observing, assessing, surviving. 30 years in the United States Army had forged an unshakable core of discipline and quiet courage within him, qualities that radiated outward even in his stillness. Today, as on many afternoons when the weather permitted this small ritual, a glass-fronted display case rested on the sturdy wicker table beside his chair. It was modest in size, but its contents spoke volumes. Inside, nestled against a bed of deep navy velvet, lay the tangible chronicle of his service, the hard-won currency of sacrifice. There gleamed the silver star, earned on a brutally frozen hillside somewhere north of the 38th parallel in Korea, a memory etched in ice and fire. Beside it lay bronze stars, testaments to endurance in the suffocating jungles of Vietnam, places that still visited his dreams sometimes, smelling of mud and fear. The Purple Heart, a stark reminder of flesh meeting metal, rested near campaign ribbons tracing conflicts across continents and decades. Marksmanship badges, symbols of practiced skill, completed the collection. These were not mere ornaments, not pieces of decorative metal. They were fragments of his soul, markers of survival, whispers of fallen comrades, a silent narrative of a life given in service. They were his story. The quiet of the afternoon was suddenly punctuated by a sound both crisp and intrusive, the rhythmic click-clack of determinately sensible heels striking the pavement. The sound preceded her appearance, an auditory announcement of authority approaching. Eleanor Vance materialized from behind the meticulously sculpted curve of Elijah's privet hedge. Her posture was impeccable, ramrod straight, suggesting a spine forged of inflexible steel. A clipboard, thick with papers, was clutched tightly against her chest, less an organizational tool than a shield, or perhaps a scepter of her domain. Her silver hair was arranged in a severe, unyielding helmet, a style that brooked no argument and resisted the day's humidity with chemical fortitude. Pale blue eyes, magnified slightly by conservative eyeglasses, swept across Elijah Reed's porch. The look was not casual. It was an inspection, possessing the predatory focus of a hawk methodically scanning a field for the slightest imperfection, the smallest mouse daring to disrupt the ordained order. Eleanor Vance, chairperson of the Oakwood Preserve Homeowners Association Architectural Review Committee, a title she wielded with the gravity of a Supreme Court justice, was known, though never to her face, by a simpler, more evocative name whispered in frustrated tones behind closed doors: Karen. She saw herself as the guardian of Oakwood Preserve's aesthetic purity, the ultimate arbiter of taste, and, more importantly, conformity. Her reign was characterized by a blizzard of petty regulations, meticulously documented infractions, passive-aggressive notes left on windshields and doorsteps, and an almost supernatural talent for discovering fault, especially when the perceived offender was someone she privately categorized as not entirely suitable for the carefully curated image of the community. Newer residents, families of color, anyone who didn't fit the long-established mold often found themselves under her unwavering scrutiny. She stopped abruptly at the base of Elijah's short porch steps, her forward momentum halted, as if hitting an invisible wall. Her gaze locked onto the display case sitting beside the elderly man. A frown line, barely perceptible between her perfectly tweezed eyebrows, deepened into a distinct groove. The sunlight, filtering through the oak leaves, caught the edges of the metals, casting small, bright reflections. "Mr. Reed," she began. Her voice, though not loud initially, possessed a sharp, cutting edge that sliced effortlessly through the humid air, making the cicadas momentarily pause their droning. "We need to have a discussion regarding this display." Elijah turned his head slowly, the movement measured, conserving the energy age demanded. His eyes met hers, calm, steady, betraying nothing of his internal reaction to her tone. "Ms. Vance," he acknowledged, his voice a low, resonant rumble, like distant thunder that had lost its anger but retained its depth. "A pleasant afternoon, is it not?" Pleasantness is regrettably compromised when community standards are disregarded, Eleanor retorted swiftly, dismissing his pleasantry as irrelevant. She tapped a perfectly manicured, coral-polished fingernail against the top sheet on her clipboard. The sound was sharp, insistent. "I refer you to Article 7, Section B, Paragraph 4 of the Oakwood Preserve Covenants, Conditions and Restrictions." She recited the reference with practiced ease. Exterior decorative items exhibiting excessive glare or reflectivity visible from the public right-of-way are strictly prohibited. She gestured dismissively towards the display case, a flick of her wrist conveying profound disapproval. "Those metals," the word dripped with a strange mixture of condescension and distaste, "are reflecting sunlight quite improperly. They produce glare. It poses a distraction to drivers navigating our streets and pedestrians using the sidewalks. Furthermore," she added, her voice gaining conviction, "it significantly lowers the overall aesthetic tone of the immediate vicinity." Elijah's gaze drifted to the metals nestled on their velvet bed, then slowly returned to Eleanor's face. A flicker of something, disbelief mixed with a weary resignation, crossed his composed features, but it was gone as quickly as it appeared. "Ms. Vance," he stated, his voice still quiet but firm. "With all due respect, these are not decorative items in the sense your rule likely intends. They are my service medals. Earned. The purpose attributed to the items is entirely irrelevant to the application of the rule." Eleanor snapped back, her composure starting to fray at the edges. The challenge, however mild, was unexpected. "Their effect is glare. Glare constitutes a violation. It is unambiguous. You are required to take them inside your residence." Immediately, a profound stillness settled over Elijah. He looked past Eleanor, towards the ancient oak, its leaves whispering secrets only the wind could understand. Then, his eyes returned to hers, holding her gaze without flinching. "No," he said. The word was spoken softly, barely louder than a breath, yet it resonated with an absolute, unshakable finality forged over 9 decades. "I am on my own property, Miss Vance. These metals," he gestured slightly towards the case, "represent my life. They represent my service to this country, a service that allows communities like Oakwood Preserve to exist in peace. They represent comrades who never came home. They stay where they are." A dark, angry flush began to creep up Eleanor Vance's neck, spreading like spilled wine onto her cheeks. Her authority, the carefully constructed edifice of control she had built around herself, had been directly challenged. Flouted. And by him. An old man. A black man. Someone who, in her unvoiced hierarchy, should have known his place. Her lips, usually set in a line of prim disapproval, thinned into a venomous, almost invisible slit. "People like you," she hissed, the words escaping like steam from a boiling kettle. Her meticulously maintained facade of neighborhood stewardship crumbled, revealing the ugliness beneath. "You always think the rules don't apply to you. You move into established, respectable neighborhoods and assume you can just do whatever you please, disregard the standards that maintain our property values and our quality of life." Her voice rose, quivering slightly with indignation. "This community has standards, Mr. Reed. High standards. Standards which I, as a duly appointed representative of the Homeowners Association, am obligated, indeed duty-bound, to uphold." The distinct squeak of the screen door opening broke the escalating tension. Maya Johnson, Elijah's granddaughter, stepped onto the porch, letting the door swing gently shut behind her. She was a vibrant woman in her mid-20s, intelligent eyes assessing the scene instantly. She was staying with her grandfather temporarily, Putting the finishing touches on her online master's thesis, her laptop usually open on the kitchen table. The raised voices had carried clearly through the open living room window. "Grandpa, is everything okay?" she asked, her gaze shifting from Elijah's unusually rigid posture to the palpable fury radiating from Eleanor Vance on the sidewalk below. "Ms. Vance, what's going on?" "Everything is decidedly not okay, young lady," Eleanor declared, swiveling her glare towards Maya as if welcoming a new target for her wrath. "Your grandfather is deliberately, willfully violating binding HOA regulations. He is creating a public nuisance with these shiny trinkets." She spat the last words out. Maya felt a surge of protective anger rise in her chest. She saw the almost imperceptible tremor in her grandfather's hand where it rested on the arm of his wheelchair, a telltale sign of distress he rarely showed. Something felt deeply wrong, ugly, simmering just below the surface of this absurd argument about metals. Almost on instinct, honed by years of navigating online interactions and witnessing public confrontations, Maya slipped her smartphone from her pocket. With practiced thumbs, she unlocked it and tapped the icon for her preferred social media platform's livestream function. Holding the phone somewhat discreetly by her side, angled slightly to capture both Eleanor on the sidewalk and her grandfather in his chair, she hit go live. The little red light blinked on. "What specific regulations are you referring to, Ms. Vance?" Maya asked, deliberately keeping her voice calm and level, projecting reasonableness in the face of Eleanor's rising agitation. "He's just sitting quietly on his own porch. He is displaying prohibited items." Eleanor shrieked now, her voice escalating into a shrill, unpleasant register that grated on the humid air. Control was slipping away from her rapidly. She took an aggressive step forward, right up to the edge of the porch railing, planting her feet firmly. Her eyes, narrowed and intense, remained locked on Elijah, ignoring Maya almost completely. "I am the authority here. You will show respect for the rules of this community. You will comply." "Ms. Vance, I need you to please lower your voice," Maya said, her voice firmer now, ensuring the phone's microphone was picking up the exchange clearly. The viewer count on her stream was already ticking upwards. "You're clearly upsetting my grandfather." "Upsetting him?" Eleanor laughed, a harsh, grating sound devoid of any humor. It was the sound of frayed nerves and pure malice. "He's upsetting the entire neighborhood with his defiance, his disregard. I warned you. I gave you a chance to comply." Her right hand, agitated, suddenly dove into the large, expensive-looking leather handbag slung over her shoulder. It rummaged for a second, then emerged, clutching a black canister. Maya's breath caught in her throat. Her eyes widened in disbelief and horror. "No, Ms. Vance, don't." But Eleanor Vance, consumed by a toxic brew of perceived entitlement, prejudice, and blinding rage, seemed beyond reason. She raised the canister, pointing the nozzle directly, deliberately, at the face of the 92-year-old decorated combat veteran sitting defenseless in his wheelchair mere feet away. "You defiant old man," she screamed, her face contorted in a mask of fury, and she pressed the nozzle firmly. A thick, viscous stream of bright orange liquid erupted from the canister. It shot across the short distance, engulfing Elijah Reed's face, hitting him squarely in the eyes, nose, and mouth. He cried out, a strangled, agonized sound torn from his throat, instantly muffled as he choked. His frail hands flew reflexively to his face, clawing at his burning eyes as he gasped desperately for air, his body racked by violent, uncontrollable coughing. The acrid, pungent stench of capsaicin exploded into the air, instantly burning nostrils, stinging eyes even from several feet away. It smelled like chemical violence. "Grandpa!" Maya screamed, pure terror and rage momentarily paralyzing her before adrenaline kicked in. She dropped her phone onto the wicker table, the live stream still rolling, broadcasting the unfolding horror to a growing online audience, and rushed frantically to her grandfather's side. "Oh my God! Water! Somebody get water! Please!" she yelled, her voice cracking with panic. The live stream continued its unblinking capture of the horrific tableau. The elderly veteran, blinded and choking, slumped in his chair, his granddaughter, desperate and sobbing, trying futilely to wipe the orange chemical agent from his face with a crumpled napkin she'd grabbed. and Eleanor Vance, standing frozen on the sidewalk below, the pepper spray canister still gripped tightly in her white-knuckled hand, her chest heaving, a shocking look of twisted, vindicated triumph flickering across her flushed face before being replaced by a dawning awareness of what she had just done. The screams, Elijah's choked cries, Maya's panicked shouts, finally pierced the neighborhood's humid apathy. Doors began to open. Neighbors, initially curious, spilled out onto their lawns and sidewalks, their expressions shifting rapidly from inquiry to disbelief, then to utter horror as they took in the scene on Elijah Reed's porch. Someone, a man from across the street, was already on his phone, voice urgent. Yes, 911. I need police and ambulance immediately. 12, Oak Street, Oakwood Preserve. An elderly man has just been assaulted. Yes, pepper sprayed right in the face. By a neighbor. Hurry. Maya, her hands shaking so violently she could barely function, fumbled for her own phone again, snatching it from the table. With one hand trying clumsily to soothe Elijah, dabbing at his streaming eyes with the now useless napkin, she managed to dial her father's number with the other. Dad, you need to get here. Right now? Oakwood Preserve. Grandpa's house. It's Eleanor Vance. She just pepper sprayed Grandpa. Right in his face. Over his medals. Dad, I got it all on video. Please hurry. Her words tumbled out in a torrent of tears and frantic urgency. Marcus Johnson arrived less than 10 minutes later, his dark sedan screeching to a halt just behind the first responding police cruiser, its lights already flashing, bathing the scene in pulses of red and blue. He vaulted out of the driver's seat, his usual demeanor of calm competence stretched thin, a barely contained shield over a maelstrom of cold, protective fury. Marcus was a man conditioned by pressure, hardened by decades serving as a senior lawyer in the Army's prestigious Judge Advocate General's JAG Corps. He had navigated the complexities of military justice, international law treaties, courts-martial involving life and death. He radiated an aura of quiet, unshakable authority. But seeing his father-in-law, Elijah, Sergeant Major Reed, slumped in his wheelchair, face fiery red and swollen, skin glistening with sweat and residual chemicals, surrounded by frantic neighbors and newly arrived paramedics gently working on him, ignited a primal rage he rarely allowed himself to feel, let alone show. Maya ran to him the moment she saw him, collapsing against his chest, tears streaming down her face. Dad, she just sprayed him. Like an animal. Right in the eyes. Because she didn't like his medals glaring. She called him. She said people like you. Marcus held his daughter tight for a brief moment, then gently set her back. His gaze swept the scene with practiced efficiency, absorbing every detail in seconds. Elijah, now being carefully assessed by the paramedics, his breathing still ragged but less panicked. Maya, distraught but coherent. The cluster of concerned, shocked neighbors murmuring amongst themselves. The smartphone still lying conspicuously on the wicker table, presumably still recording or having just finished. And Eleanor Vance, standing near the two police officers who had arrived first, already launching into a rapid-fire, self-serving narrative, gesturing emphatically. He was becoming increasingly belligerent, officer. Eleanor's voice carried, sharp and defensive. He absolutely refused to comply with legitimate HOA directives. Clear violations. Those medals were causing a definite hazard with the glare. I felt threatened. He was hostile. I genuinely feared for my safety. I had no choice but to defend myself. Marcus Johnson strode forward, his resents alone seeming to alter the dynamics of the scene. He moved with purpose, his posture erect, his expression grimly determined. The police officers, who had been listening patiently to Eleanor, turned towards him instinctively, recognizing an energy shift. "Excuse me, sir. Can I help you?" "Who are you?" one of the officers asked, polite but cautious. "I am Marcus Johnson," he stated, his voice perfectly level, yet carrying an unmistakable weight, the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being heard and obeyed. "Colonel, United States Army Judge Advocate General's Corps, retired." He paused, letting the title settle in the air. "This gentleman," he gestured with controlled anger towards Elijah, who was now having his eyes gently flushed by a paramedic, "is my father-in-law, Sergeant Major Elijah Reed, United States Army, retired. He is 92 years old." a decorated combat veteran of Korea and Vietnam. His gaze then shifted, locking onto Eleanor Vance with an intensity that made her visibly flinch. He pointed a steady finger directly at her. And that woman, his voice dropped slightly, taking on a dangerous edge of cold precision, just committed a heinous, cowardly act of aggravated assault against him. On his own property. Unprovoked. Eleanor bristled, recovering her bluster quickly. Now see here. That is slander. I am the victim in this situation. He was the one violating the rules. He was aggressive. Marcus ignored her outburst completely, keeping his attention focused squarely on the police officers. Officers, he continued, his tone respectful but firm, assuming a collegial understanding of legal frameworks. I trust you are familiar with the relevant state statutes concerning aggravated assault and battery, particularly the enhanced penalties when such acts are perpetrated against an elderly individual, defined typically as anyone over 60 or 65. He paused again, letting them process. Furthermore, given the specific circumstances readily apparent here, the victim's race, his clearly identifiable status as a decorated military veteran, the assailant's documented history of targeted complaints against certain residents, which my daughter has corroborating evidence of, he glanced briefly at Maya, and the hateful language used immediately prior to the assault, which Maya also witnessed. This incident warrants immediate and thorough investigation as a potential hate crime. He didn't need to quote the exact penal code sections. His authoritative summary conveyed his deep knowledge. My daughter, Maya Johnson. He indicated Maya, who, despite her shaking hands, held up her phone slightly, has captured the entire unprovoked assault, including the preceding verbal exchange, on video livestream. One of the officers, a seasoned sergeant whose name tag read Miller, nodded curtly, his expression shifting from neutrality to serious concern. He clearly recognized the gravity Marcus injected into the situation, moving it far beyond a simple neighbor dispute. Sir, Colonel, we understand, Sergeant Miller said respectfully. We appreciate the information. We are taking statements from everyone involved and assessing the situation fully. He turned to his partner. Davis, secure the phone as evidence. Make sure that video file is preserved. Then, Sergeant Miller turned his attention back to Eleanor, his tone losing all trace of patience, becoming firm and official. Ma'am, he addressed her directly. Based on the witness statements, the victim's visible injuries, and the preliminary evidence including the video recording, you need to come with us down to the station for further questioning. You are being detained at this time, pending investigation for assault. Detained? Eleanor shrieked, her face paling beneath the angry flush. The words seemed to shock her to her core. Detained? This is absolutely outrageous. Preposterous. I am a respected member of this community. I chair a committee. I have rights. You can't just. This is clearly an HOA matter that got slightly out of hand. This is a criminal matter now, Ms. Vance, Marcus stated coolly, his voice cutting through her panicked protests. Your alleged actions have dramatically exceeded any conceivable scope of homeowners association authority or enforcement. He took a step closer, lowering his voice slightly, but ensuring she heard every word. Assaulting anyone is a serious crime. Assaulting a decorated veteran, especially one of Sergeant Major Reed's age and physical condition, demonstrates a profound level of malice, cruelty, and disrespect that the justice system tends to view very, very dimly. He let the weight of his words, his implied legal expertise, the undeniable video evidence, and the stark reality of the flashing police lights sink in. While specific laws like the Service Members Civil Relief Act primarily deal with financial and legal protections during active duty, the underlying spirit of laws protecting and honoring those who have served this nation is clear. Your conduct is not merely illegal under standard assault statutes. It is morally reprehensible and potentially subject to hate crime and elder abuse enhancements that carry significant prison time. As Sergeant Miller and Officer Davis began to firmly escort a sputtering, protesting Eleanor Vance towards the waiting patrol car, my lawyer will hear about this. This is harassment. You're making a terrible mistake. Marcus turned his full attention back to Elijah. The paramedics had finished flushing his eyes and were now checking his vital signs. He was breathing more easily, though his face remained painfully inflamed, and he kept his eyes tightly shut against the lingering burn and the harsh daylight. Maya stood beside the wheelchair, relaying the events that had transpired before Marcus arrived, her voice still thick with emotion but steadier now. Marcus listened intently, his mind already working, processing information, connecting dots. Eleanor's hateful words, "people like you," echoed in his mind, resonating unpleasantly with vague whispers and complaints he'd half heard over the past couple of years, comments made by other minority families, newer residents of Oakwood Preserve, about Eleanor Vance's relentless nitpicking, her uneven application of the notoriously complex HOA rules. This wasn't just a random explosion of temper over some reflective metals. He felt a cold certainty forming in his gut. This felt targeted, premeditated in a way. The pepper spray attack, horrific as it was, might only be the most visible symptom of a deeper, more insidious problem within the seemingly placid community. He suspected this was merely the tip of a very ugly iceberg. In the following days, while Sergeant Major Elijah Reed recovered quietly at home, his eyesight thankfully pronounced unharmed by the ophthalmologist, but his spirit undeniably wounded by the violation, Marcus Johnson began his own methodical, discreet investigation. He wasn't acting in any official JAG capacity, of course, but the habits of mind ingrained over 30 years, meticulous analysis of facts, identification of patterns, deep understanding of regulations and procedures, were second nature. He started with Maya, sitting down with her and a notepad, carefully documenting her recollections not just of the assault itself, but of every prior interaction she or Elijah had experienced with Eleanor Vance since Maya had been staying there. He noted every dismissive comment, every veiled microaggression, every instance where Eleanor seemed to go out of her way to find fault. Then, acting on the disturbing echoes Maya's account stirred, Marcus began reaching out, quietly and respectfully, to other residents. He focused initially on families of color and on those who had moved into Oakwood Preserve within the last 5 to 7 years, the period roughly corresponding with Eleanor Vance's rise to prominence within the HOA structure, particularly her chairing of the powerful Architectural Review Committee. A disturbing, undeniable pattern quickly emerged, confirming Marcus's worst suspicions. He spoke with Nguyen's, a young professional couple who recounted, with weary frustration, being cited repeatedly for the precise shade of beige trim paint on their house. They had repainted it 3 times over 18 months, each time attempting to match Eleanor's shifting, vaguely defined specifications, incurring significant expense and stress, before finally landing on a shade she grudgingly approved. He listened to the Patels, who described being hit with exorbitant, rapidly escalating fines because their children's portable plastic basketball hoop was allegedly left out on their driveway 37 minutes past the HOA's strictly enforced 7 p.m. curfew on weeknights. They swore they had brought it in by 6:50 p.m., but Eleanor had produced a time-stamped photo claiming otherwise. They paid the fine to avoid further conflict. He heard from the Garcias, an older couple who had lived in their home for 15 years. They spoke of constant, low-level harassment from Eleanor about the height and material of their backyard fence, a fence that had stood unchanged and previously unremarked upon, for years before Eleanor ascended to the Architectural Review Committee. They felt perpetually under surveillance. In stark contrast, Marcus learned through discreet inquiries with longer-term, predominantly white residents, that minor infractions, a slightly overgrown lawn here, holiday decorations left up a week too long there, a garbage can left out past pickup day, were frequently overlooked or addressed with a friendly, informal reminder, rarely escalating to formal citations or fines. It became chillingly clear. Eleanor Vance wasn't just an overzealous enforcer with implicit biases. She was actively, systematically weaponizing the HOA rules. She used the covenants, conditions, and restrictions not as guidelines for community harmony, but as instruments of targeted harassment against those she deemed undesirable, those who didn't fit her narrow, prejudiced vision of Oakwood Preserve. Marcus felt that familiar cold certainty solidify into hard conviction. This level of sustained, discriminatory enforcement often required more than just biased interpretation of existing rules. It hinted at something deeper, something potentially more structurally corrupt. It suggested a possible manipulation of the rules themselves. Maya, he said one evening, spreading printouts of the current HOA bylaws, the ones Eleanor had so proudly and ultimately self-destructively cited, across the dining room table. Elijah was resting in his bedroom, the television murmuring softly. I need to get my hands on older versions of these documents. And not just the bylaws themselves, but supporting materials. Meeting minutes, draft amendments, records of votes, correspondence related to rule changes. Anything dating back, say, 5, maybe 10 years. Back to before Eleanor consolidated her power on the committee. He tapped a clause regarding exterior modifications. There are nuances here, specific phrasings, that feel overly restrictive in ways that seem designed to catch certain people out. I need to see how these rules evolved. He looked at his daughter. Do you know anyone who's lived here that long? Someone reliable, who might have kept old records. Crucially, someone who wasn't part of Eleanor's inner circle on the committee. Maya frowned, thinking, tapping her chin. Well, maybe the Hendersons? Martha Henderson, down on Chestnut Lane? She's lived here forever. I remember Mom mentioning once that Mrs. Henderson used to be the HOA secretary years ago. But she quit. Said it was getting too toxic, too political, especially after Eleanor took over the ARC. A visit to Martha Henderson, a pleasant, silver-haired woman in her late 70s, proved to be the breakthrough Marcus needed. Initially, Mrs. Henderson seemed hesitant, cautious about dredging up old neighborhood politics, and clearly wanting no further association with the HOA's internal dramas. But when Marcus gently explained the reason for his inquiry, recounting the horrific assault on Sergeant Major Reed, her neighbor, a man she occasionally waved to, her reluctance evaporated, replaced by quiet, simmering indignation. That woman, Martha said, her lips tightening. Eleanor Vance. I'm not surprised. Not really. The power went to her head, and she always had a particular way of looking at people who were different. Shaking her head sadly, she disappeared into her house and returned minutes later from the attic, carrying a dusty cardboard banker's box meticulously labeled HOA Records 2010 to 2018. I kept everything from my time as secretary, she explained, handing the box to Marcus. Minutes, drafts, correspondence. After I quit, nobody asked for these specific files, and I just kept them. Maybe you'll find something useful in here. What she did to Mr. Reed, it's just wrong. Marcus spent the next 2 nights immersed in the contents of Martha Henderson's box, fueled by coffee and a growing sense of controlled outrage. He painstakingly compared the older documents, typed meeting minutes signed by Martha, draft amendments with handwritten notes in the margins, copies of the official bylaws from her tenure, with the current set of rules Eleanor Vance had been enforcing with such prejudice. He cross-referenced dates, clause numbers, specific wording, and, critically, the records of votes on proposed amendments. The discovery, when it finally crystallized amidst the piles of paper laid on the second night, was far more chilling, more brazen, than he had initially suspected. It wasn't just biased enforcement. It was outright fraud, layered with potential criminal conspiracy. Several key amendments, particularly those tightening restrictions on aesthetic standards, like paint colors and fence heights, establishing complex schedules for property maintenance, and outlining the structure for imposing and escalating fines, appeared in the current bylaws Eleanor wielded, but lacked any corresponding record of discussion, motion, or formal approval vote in the official meeting minutes from the period Mrs. Henderson's files covered, or in the sparser, less detailed minutes available from the years immediately following her departure. More damningly, Marcus unearthed subtle but crucial discrepancies in the wording between certain draft amendments that were recorded as being discussed in meetings, and sometimes narrowly defeated or tabled for revision, and the final versions that somehow materialized in the official rulebook published during Eleanor's subsequent tenure as committee chair. Clauses had been quietly inserted. Definitions were altered. Temporary structure, for instance, was redefined with a much shorter time limit, directly impacting things like the Patel's basketball hoop. Loopholes benefiting long-term residents seemed to remain open or were even subtly widened, while regulations affecting newer construction or modifications favored by younger families or different cultural tastes were tightened mercilessly. But the truly explosive finding came when Marcus started cross-referencing the dates of these undocumented or altered amendments with HOA financial records he requested through preliminary legal discovery related to the assault case. He noticed unusual payments authorized around the same time some of the most suspicious bylaw changes seemed to have been implemented. Payments to vaguely described consulting services or administrative fees, often signed off by Eleanor and one other board member, Gary Prentice, the HOA treasurer who had taken office shortly after Mrs. Henderson resigned. A cold hypothesis formed. He dug deeper into the financial records, comparing expenditures against the approved budget lines from older meeting minutes. There it was, a pattern of small but consistent overpayments to certain landscaping and maintenance contractors favored by Eleanor. Minor discrepancies in reported fine collections versus deposits, and those recurring consulting payments to a shell company Marcus quickly traced back to Gary Prentice's brother-in-law. Eleanor Vance hadn't just been a biased enforcer manipulating rules. She had actively, criminally doctored the governing documents of the Oakwood Preserve Homeowners Association. And she hadn't done it alone. She'd had an accomplice, the treasurer Gary Prentice, who likely helped her falsify or lose meeting minutes, insert unapproved clauses into the official bylaws, and rubber stamp her actions. And together, under the cover of her manufactured authority and the complexity of the rules she herself had distorted, they had been systematically embezzling HOA funds for years. She had falsified records not only to embed her prejudice into the very legal framework of the community, but also to facilitate and conceal her own financial crimes. The attack on Elijah wasn't just about metals. It was potentially about silencing someone who dared question her absolute authority, an authority she needed to maintain to protect her entire fraudulent enterprise. Armed with this devastating combination of evidence, the viral video of the assault, Maya's testimony, the corroborating accounts from numerous harassed families, the meticulously documented proof of the falsified bylaws provided by Mrs. Henderson's records, and the newly uncovered financial irregularities pointing towards embezzlement and conspiracy. Marcus Johnson contacted a prominent civil rights law firm in the city known for taking on complex discrimination cases. He laid out the entire situation: the vicious assault on his elderly father-in-law, the clear racial animus expressed, the documented pattern of systematic housing discrimination targeting minorities and newer residents, the weaponization of HOA rules, and now, the explosive evidence of document fraud, conspiracy, and embezzlement perpetrated by Eleanor Vance and potentially Gary Prentice. He didn't need to deliver lengthy explanations. He quietly presented the key documents, the side-by-side comparison of the bylaws, copies of the suspect financial transactions, Martha Henderson's sworn affidavit authenticating her records, and, of course, the link to Maya's live-stream video, which had already garnered millions of views and widespread media attention. The senior partners at the law firm recognized the significance immediately. This wasn't just one rogue Karen. This was a textbook case, albeit an unusually blatant and violent one, of housing discrimination facilitated by systemic corruption and fraud, culminating in a brutal hate crime against a vulnerable, elderly veteran. The added layer of embezzlement and conspiracy elevated it further. A comprehensive class action lawsuit was swiftly filed. It named Eleanor Vance personally, Gary Prentice personally, and the Oakwood Preserve HOA as an entity, due to negligence and oversight and potential complicity of other board members who looked the other way. The suit alleged violations of the Federal Fair Housing Act, state anti-discrimination laws, conspiracy to commit fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, embezzlement, assault, battery, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. It sought not only compensatory damages for all affected families, but also significant punitive damages designed to punish the defendant's malicious conduct and deter similar behavior in other HOAs. Simultaneously, Marcus ensured that all the evidence related to the doctored bylaws, the embezzlement scheme, and Gary Prentice's involvement was immediately provided to the district attorney's office handling Eleanor Vance's criminal prosecution. This added potential charges of felony fraud, forgery, conspiracy, and potentially perjury related to her initial statements to police, to the already serious charges of aggravated assault with hate crime and elder abuse enhancements. The DA also opened a separate investigation into Gary Prentice. The viral livestream video had ignited a firestorm. News outlets across the country picked up the story, often using the irresistible headline, "Caught on camera. HOA president pepper sprays 92-year-old black veteran over service medals." Public outrage was swift and immense. Hashtags like #JusticeForSG trended for days. Donations poured into a legal defense fund established for Elijah and to support the class action suit for the other affected families. The pressure on the remaining members of the Oakwood Preserve HOA board, individuals who had, through complacency, fear, or perhaps willful ignorance, enabled Eleanor Vance's reign for years, became unbearable. Faced with public condemnation, the threat of personal liability in the lawsuit, and the revelation of embezzlement within their ranks, the board collapsed. An emergency community meeting, attended by a large, angry, and newly energized group of residents, saw the remaining board members resign en masse. An interim committee, composed of diverse residents committed to transparency and immediate cooperation with both the criminal investigation and the civil lawsuit, was quickly formed. Gary Prentice, confronted with the evidence Marcus had uncovered, resigned his position and reportedly hired a criminal defense attorney. Eleanor Vance's carefully constructed world imploded with astonishing speed. Her criminal trial was expedited due to the victim's age and the intense public interest. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. They presented Maya's clear, damning video. They called the paramedics who treated Elijah's injuries. They presented Elijah himself, who gave quiet, dignified, yet powerful testimony about the attack and the significance of his medals. They introduced evidence of Eleanor's prior discriminatory actions against other residents, establishing a pattern of animus. They detailed the fraudulent bylaws and the embezzlement scheme, painting a picture of a defendant motivated by prejudice, greed, and a desperate need to maintain control. Eleanor's defense, centered on her claim of feeling threatened by a frail, 92-year-old man in a wheelchair discussing his service medals, crumbled under the weight of the visual evidence and her own documented history of targeted hostility. Her attempts to portray herself as a dedicated community servant enforcing necessary rules sounded hollow and delusional in the face of the facts. The jury returned guilty verdicts on all major counts: aggravated assault, battery, elder abuse, with hate crime enhancements adding significant weight, multiple counts of felony fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. At sentencing, the judge delivered a scathing rebuke, citing Eleanor's egregious abuse of a position of trust, her shocking lack of remorse, her cowardly and hateful attack on a venerable member of our community who served this nation with honor, and her calculated scheme to defraud her neighbors. Considering the severity of the crimes and the enhancements, he sentenced Eleanor Vance to 10 years in state prison. Gary Prentice, facing his own trial, eventually pleaded guilty to conspiracy and embezzlement charges and received a lesser sentence in exchange for his testimony against Eleanor. The civil class action suit concluded shortly after Eleanor's criminal conviction. Faced with the irrefutable evidence of the doctored bylaws, the embezzlement, the guilty verdicts in the criminal case, and dozens of credible witnesses testifying to years of discriminatory harassment and financial harm, the court found Eleanor Vance and Gary Prentice fully liable. The former HOA leadership was also found negligent, making the association itself liable for damages. The judgment was staggering. Significant compensatory damages were awarded to Sergeant Major Reed for his physical injuries, pain, suffering, and emotional distress. Compensatory damages were also awarded to all the families who had been unfairly fined, harassed, forced into unnecessary expenses, like the Nguyen's repainting, or effectively driven out of the neighborhood by the discriminatory and fraudulent practices. On top of that, the court levied massive punitive damages against Eleanor Vance and Gary Prentice personally, specifically designed to punish their malicious conduct, strip them of their ill-gotten gains, and send a clear message that such behavior would not be tolerated. Eleanor Vance, stripped of her authority, her reputation shredded, her name now synonymous with bigotry and corruption, was financially obliterated. The multi-million-dollar civil judgment, combined with criminal fines, restitution orders for the embezzled funds, and her own substantial legal fees, forced her into immediate bankruptcy. Her meticulously maintained house in Oakwood Preserve, the very castle from which she had surveyed her petty kingdom and judged her neighbors, was seized and sold at auction. The proceeds went directly towards satisfying a fraction of the enormous judgment against her. Every asset she possessed, every stock, every bond, every piece of jewelry, was liquidated. Her downfall was absolute, a complete and utter ruin. From the self-proclaimed Queen of Oakwood Preserve to a convicted felon, bankrupt, incarcerated, and stripped of everything, her story became a harsh cautionary tale whispered throughout the region. A different kind of quiet gradually settled over Oakwood Preserve in the months that followed Eleanor's conviction and the resolution of the lawsuit. It wasn't the tense, anxious silence of neighbors afraid of arbitrary rules and watchful eyes. It was the calm, peaceful quiet of healing, of relief, of a community slowly breathing again. A new, genuinely diverse HOA board was elected, composed of residents committed to transparency, fairness, and rebuilding trust. Their first act was to formally rescind all the fraudulent bylaws Eleanor and Gary had implemented. They worked with the community, holding open forums, to develop a new, simplified, and equitable set of rules focused on genuine community well-being rather than punitive control. Neighbors stopped glancing nervously over their shoulders. People started talking to each other more freely, sharing gardening tips over fences, organizing potlucks in the community park. Gardens began to bloom with flowers of all varieties and colors, no longer subject to the tyranny of approved palettes. The Patel's kids played basketball freely on their driveway. The Nguyen's painted their trim a lovely shade of blue they'd always wanted. The Garcias repaired their fence without fear of reprisal. On his porch, Sergeant Major Elijah Reed sat peacefully in his wheelchair. The late summer sun, gentler now, filtered through the leaves of the ancient oak. The glass-fronted display case, containing his silver star, his bronze stars, his purple heart, rested once again on the wicker table beside him, catching the light softly, without offense. Neighbors walking by would offer a respectful nod, a genuine smile, a friendly wave. Some stopped to chat, asking about his health, sharing neighborhood news, or simply thanking him, quietly, for his service and his resilience. Maya sat with him often, sometimes reading aloud from a history book, sometimes just sharing the comfortable silence. The raw trauma of that horrible afternoon was slowly receding, replaced by the quiet, profound satisfaction of justice served, of dignity restored. Marcus Johnson visited frequently, standing beside his father-in-law, watching him absorb the peaceful afternoon. He saw a man who had faced down enemies on frozen hillsides and in sweltering jungles, who had endured unimaginable hardships in service to his country, now finally able to rest peacefully on his own porch, in his own home. Elijah's ordeal had inadvertently become a catalyst for positive change, forcing the community to confront the ugliness that had festered beneath its pristine surface. His quiet courage in the face of petty tyranny, Maya's quick thinking with her phone, and Marcus's determined pursuit of truth had not only brought down a corrupt individual, but had also liberated a neighborhood. The reign of Oakwood Preserve's Karen was definitively over. All that remained was the cautionary tale she left behind, and a community slowly, deliberately rebuilding itself on foundations of mutual respect, genuine inclusion, and the simple, hard-won peace Elijah Reed so richly deserved. His medals gleamed softly in the afternoon light, no longer a point of contention, but a silent, enduring symbol of honor finally recognized, finally safe at home.